Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when laws were as unpredictable as the weather, and just as difficult to argue with. You're standing on a muddy medieval street in England. Your boots squelch softly, mist curls around old stone buildings, and someone's sheep has definitely gotten loose again. The air smells like firewood, dung, and regret. You reach up to adjust your hat, and that's your first mistake. See, it's Sunday. And in the year 1571, Parliament decided that your headwear better meet very specific standards, or else. That's right. One of the strangest laws to ever grace the English books was about who could wear what on their heads, and when. To support domestic wool production, and to give the upper class one more way to gatekeep style, Queen Elizabeth I passed a law requiring every male over 6 years old to wear a wool cap on Sundays and holidays. But not just any cap. It had to be made in England, of English wool, and approved by a local master hatmaker. Fail to comply? That'll be a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence, thank you very much. So there you are, fiddling with a fine imported beaver felt number you bought off a charming Flemish merchant. You thought you looked dashing. The constable, however, is already calculating your fine with a smile. It's like wearing sneakers to a black tie dinner, except the host is the crown, and the consequence is partial economic ruin. Historians still argue whether this hat law was truly about economics or more about reinforcing class divisions. After all, the nobility had always used fashion to distinguish themselves. Sumptuary laws restricted commoners from wearing velvet, silk, and even certain colors. But hats? That was a new frontier. Now imagine the local wool cap industry scrambling to meet demand. Some poor shepherd named Henry is suddenly working overtime spinning wool instead of napping under a hedge. Milliners rejoice. Foreign hat traders quietly panic. And teenage boys everywhere suffer the indignity of being forced to wear itchy caps that flatten their carefully fluffed hair. Oh, and women? Exempt. Apparently, female headwear was just too complicated to legislate. Which, fair enough. Have you seen the architectural nightmare that was a hennin? One cheeky story tells of a nobleman's son who, in protest, began wearing an enormous wool cap only on Sundays, big enough to hold a loaf of bread inside. Whether or not that's true, it paints a delightful image of medieval passive aggression. By the time the law was repealed decades later, most people had stopped enforcing it seriously. Like many bizarre mandates, it lingered in the books far longer than it did in practice, gathering dust alongside other forgotten quirks, like laws about where you could dry fish and how loud a tavern fiddle was allowed to be. You tiptoe past a row of villagers now, their caps bobbing gently in the morning mist. A dog barks in the distance, possibly wearing a cap too, because hey, maybe it's better to be safe than fined. The whole thing feels dreamlike, doesn't it? Like a rule made in a fever, during a town council meeting that went on far too long after the mead had kicked in. And yet, that one little law whispers volumes about medieval identity. To wear the right wool hat was to belong, to show loyalty, patriotism, and a clean conscience. To wear the wrong one? That was treason, or at least disrespect. Imagine being judged not for your character, but for the fiber content of your headgear. As the mist begins to clear, you spot the town square. The wool merchant is already setting up shop. Behind him, a scribe carves notices into a wooden board. One reads, "All males shall wear woolen caps this Sabbath, under penalty of law. No exceptions for style preferences. Yes, even you, Richard." And just like that, we're off to a wonderfully strange start. But don't get too comfortable yet. We've only just scratched the brim of what's to come. You step off the cobbled path and into the cool shade of a Spanish stone church. Candles flicker gently, casting buttery halos of light onto worn tapestries and solemn saints. But as you approach the heavy wooden doors, a guard stops you. Not for your shoes, nor your cloak, but for something far more personal. He leans in, sniffs, and with a stern shake of his head, he points to a nearby fountain. You, dear listener, reek of garlic. It sounds absurd now, but in 13th century Spain, Garlic breath wasn't just socially awkward, it was legally problematic. In certain towns, municipal ordinances banned individuals from entering churches, courts, or public assemblies if they smelled strongly of garlic or onions. That's right. Your lunch could disqualify you from testifying in court or worshiping in mass. The reasoning? Partly decorum. These were places of solemnity, and strong odors were considered disruptive. But partly, it was status. Garlic was seen as a peasant's food, pungent and crude. Nobles dined on herbs and mild sauces. The working class had garlic by the fistful. So in a way, garlic bans served to filter out the riffraff, keeping certain institutions comfortably fragrant. Historians still argue whether these garlic laws were strictly enforced or mostly symbolic. Some suggest they were weaponized, used as a handy excuse to exclude unwanted voices from civic discourse. Others say they were more like hygiene recommendations with teeth. Still, there are records of people being denied entry to court proceedings until they'd purified their breath. Imagine standing outside a tribunal while your friend rushes to find you mint leaves or sticks of cinnamon bark. Breath mints, medieval style. There's even a fringe tale of one clever merchant who, accused of garlic breath-induced disruption, showed up to his trial chewing lavender petals. He lost the case but won admiration for flair. And garlic wasn't alone. A handful of towns extended the rule to leeks, fermented onions, or any allium consumed in uncooked form. Basically, if it made you smell like the stew pot of a night watchman, it was a no-go. The clergy, especially, took issue. Sermons delivered in tight stone chapels left no room for aromatic surprises. One chronicler complained that a single garlic-mouthed worshiper could chase the Holy Spirit clear out of the nave. But this garlic prejudice didn't just stop at the church door. In some places, marriage contracts included clauses limiting garlic use, particularly before conjugal nights. Which, let's be honest, is the most medieval way to say, honey, maybe don't have that third clove before bed. You now find yourself meandering through a medieval marketplace. A breeze carries the scent of herbs and roasting meat. You pass a vendor selling bundles of garlic, tied in braids, hung in rows like glistening pale pearls. He winks at you. Best not if you've got court tomorrow, he mutters, almost conspiratorially. Later that night, you dine with a farmer and his family. There's soup, dark bread, and yes, garlic, loads of it. They laugh about the law. Silly city rules, the farmer says, waving a spoon. Let them smell lilies while we do the real work. This gap between urban law and rural life was typical. While city-states wrote fragrant ordinances, countryside folk still saw garlic as healthful, even holy. Monks grew it in medicinal gardens. Soldiers chewed it before battle. Some thought it warded off plague. Others just liked the flavor. And here's a fun twist. Some churches quietly ignored the ban, especially during holy festivals when garlic-rich stews were communal staples. One Benedictine monk recorded a particularly blessed Lent, where, quote, the garlic was abundant, and the sermons were brief. And you know what? That sounds kind of perfect. As the stars come out and the fire crackles, you sit back, belly full, breath pungent, and utterly at peace. You may not be welcome in court tomorrow, but tonight, among friends, no law can touch you. You're back on the cobblestones again, wandering through a sleepy medieval hamlet, where shutters creak gently in the wind and every street corner seems to hold a new surprise. A group of children plays marbles beneath a flickering lantern. A baker yawns from behind his stall. All seems quiet, until you see the poster nailed to the town's notice board. Trial of the Toad, all are welcome. Wednesday, after Vespers. You blink. Surely it's a jest. But no, it's very real. You, dear listener, are about to attend one of history's strangest rituals, the animal trials of medieval Europe. You take a seat in the wooden benches of the town hall, beside neighbors who chatter excitedly and chew roasted chickpeas. At the front, a judge in robes clears his throat. On the table before him, a toad, fat, warty, indignant. Because you see, for centuries across France, Italy, and even parts of Switzerland, animals could be tried in human courts for crimes ranging from crop destruction to manslaughter. Toads, pigs, rats, and even insects were regularly brought up on charges. And no, this wasn't symbolic theater. It was fully judicial. Animals were assigned defense attorneys, verdicts were passed, and in some cases, punishments were carried out. Historians still argue whether these trials were meant as serious proceedings, religious rituals, or elaborate public morality plays. But the court records don't lie. One 15th century case in Savigny involved a pig who was hanged for killing a child, complete with a tiny suit of human clothes and a solemn march to the gallows. And this toad? It stands accused of blighting a communal well. Witnesses claim it croaked ominously before several cases of stomach upset. The priest says it might be demon-possessed. The local herbalist argues it's just a cranky amphibian. The defense attorney, yes, an actual man in a frayed cloak, argues that no scientific evidence links the toad to the illnesses. He cites scripture. The toad blinks. You watch the proceedings with a mix of horror and awe. The air is thick with incense and absurdity. A court scribe records every word. A child in the back giggles until his mother hushes him. No one knows how this will go, but everyone's invested. Even stranger. If convicted, the toad won't be squashed. That would be uncivilized. Instead, it might be excommunicated. Yes, denied access to divine grace. The sentence will be read aloud, and the toad banished beyond the town limits with ceremonial bell ringing. There's even precedent. In 1519, a group of weevils in Autumn, France, were excommunicated after destroying a vineyard. The town gave them a lawyer and everything. Some trials bordered on comedy. One record tells of rats summoned to court for grain theft. When they didn't show up, the lawyer argued that travel was dangerous due to cat interference. The judge granted a delay, but some were deadly serious. Pigs who harmed humans could be publicly executed. Horses, too. And while this feels surreal now, it reflects a mindset where God's law applied to all creation, even those without language or property. You lean forward as the judge begins his final statement. He praises the defense's passion. Then, in a tone soaked with gravitas, he declares the toad banished. The townsfolk nod solemnly. The toad is placed gently into a bucket and carried outside the village gates, where it's released with a priestly chant. No one laughs, not even you. There's something oddly moving about it. The toad hops away, unaware that it's just become part of jurisprudential history. Later that evening, by firelight, the townspeople discuss the trial. Some think it was fair. Others think it's a waste of time. Better than arguing about taxes, one man says, shrugging. A young girl doodles a toad in the dust and names it Sir Croaks-a-lot. You think back to the trial as you drift off. It was ridiculous, yes, but also deeply human. In a world filled with chaos, illness, and mystery, sometimes the only way to feel in control is to put a toad on trial. And really, who are we to judge? You're pacing slowly down the cloister walk of a stone monastery, your footsteps muffled by moss and the soft whisper of distant bells. Around you, monks in simple robes pass quietly, their heads bowed, hands clasped. All seems serene, until you catch a flicker of motion through an archway. You peek in, and there they are. Two monks, a wooden board between them, pieces clicking gently into place. They're playing chess, and in this particular corner of 12th century France, that's a problem. Because despite its noble origins, chess was once outlawed for monks and clergy across much of Europe, deemed by some church authorities to be a sinful distraction, on par with gambling, drinking, and dicing. Yes, you heard right. Those tiny carved knights and bishops were seen as dangerous tools of vanity and idleness, and for some, even worse. You crouch beside a sun-warmed column, watching as the older monk frowns and mutters something about his rook. The younger one smiles slyly. It's all very hush-hush, but if caught, they could face penance. In stricter orders, repeated chess offenses led to suspension from sacraments, or even expulsion. Historians still argue whether the bans were about the game itself or simply the way it was played. Chess required intense concentration, emotional investment, And yes, the occasional sore loser moment, none of which fit the quiet humility expected in cloistered life. Plus, it was popular with knights and aristocrats, which automatically made it suspicious to the more austere monastic minds. And yet, monks couldn't resist. The game was intellectual, strategic, beautiful. Manuscripts from the period include hand-drawn boards, annotated plays, even poetic musings about chess as a metaphor for virtue. Every piece has its place, wrote one Carthusian monk, as every soul its station. To get around the rules, some monks made secret chess sets out of bread, baking soft, lumpy pawns they could eat if the abbot approached. Others disguised the game as religious meditation, claiming that the black and white board represented the eternal struggle between good and evil. A bishop piece, naturally, stood in for spiritual authority. How convenient. In England, the Cistercian order took a hard stance. No games, period. But across the Alps in Italy, the Benedictines were more forgiving, even allowing chess during certain feast days. You can almost imagine the whispered debates over dinner. What if we only play during Lent? What if we just watch someone else play? What if we say it's a lesson in strategy against temptation? One particularly cheeky monk, Brother Renaud of Tours, reportedly trained a pet raven to knock over his opponent's king at key moments. The raven, it seems, was never formally reprimanded. Tonight, as the moonlight streams through stained glass and paints soft red circles on the cloister floor, you sense that the game is more than play. It's a lifeline. A brief window of creative thought in a world of rote ritual and rigid schedules. The older monk lets out a low sigh. "Checkmate," says the younger. A moment of silence. Then, they quickly sweep the pieces into their sleeves and stand. A figure in dark robes is approaching from down the corridor. You vanish into shadow just in time. Later, curled up in a tiny guest cell with a straw mattress and the comforting smell of beeswax and parchment, you wonder why the church feared chess so much. Maybe it was because, like thought itself, it could not be easily contained. One wrong move, one distraction, and suddenly your mind was somewhere far from the Psalms. Somewhere thrilling, daring, alive. Not bad for a board game. And even if it earned you a few extra Hail Marys, at least you got to keep your queen. You rise with the sun, blinking through a golden haze as the first rays filter through a small window. A rooster cries somewhere in the distance. Your back aches faintly from the straw mattress, but the scent of fresh herbs and firewood nudges you toward wakefulness. Today, you've traveled to late medieval Hungary, and you're about to discover that your morning routine is, quite literally, a matter of public record. As you trudge toward the village square, rubbing sleep from your eyes, a clerk in a blue cap intercepts you with a leather-bound book and a quill dripping ink. "Name?" he asks. You?" He nods and flips to a fresh page. "And how many times have you bathed this month?" You freeze, because you haven't. Yes, friend, you've stumbled into a strange and squeaky clean slice of history. In some regions of medieval Hungary and Central Europe, there were laws that mandated regular bathing, especially in market towns and certain guilds. Public health concerns drove the trend, along with a growing awareness of hygiene's connection to disease prevention. And it wasn't just strongly recommended, it was recorded. Now, to be fair, bathing in the medieval world has a reputation problem. Many imagine a 1,000-year funk, a continent of unwashed peasants living in joyful filth. But that's an oversimplification. Bathhouses existed throughout Europe, particularly in Hungary, Bohemia, the Ottoman-influenced Balkans, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Communal bathing was often a social, even luxurious affair, with hot water, oils, and steam. But where things get weird is the record-keeping. In some Hungarian towns, citizens were required to log their baths, especially if they worked in food trades, apothecaries, or midwifery. Master butchers, for example, had to bathe weekly or face fines. Barbers, too. And if you were suspected of skipping, inspectors could show up, sniffing the air like suspicious basset hounds. Historians still argue whether these records were strictly enforced or more of a bureaucratic fantasy. After all, Who could monitor every bath taken in a washtub behind a curtain? But enough evidence survives to suggest that guilds took it seriously. One shoemaker's apprentice was reportedly dismissed for lying about his monthly scrub. His boss had noticed the persistent whiff of goat. You continue down the lane toward a bathhouse, a long, timber-framed building with steam billowing from the roof and the low hum of gossiping patrons. Inside, the scene is warm and echoey. Barrels of water hiss on iron stoves. People lounge on benches, sipping spiced beer and discussing local politics. It's part spa, part town hall, part very damp living room. A sign on the wall reads, "Cleanliness is next to breadliness. Bath once a fortnight or pay a groschen." Some rules even specified minimum bath counts per season, with extra emphasis in spring, when illnesses were thought to bloom like weeds. If you lived near a river and failed to take advantage of it, your neighbors might report you. If you bragged about never bathing, you could be shunned. And if you dared bathe too often, that raised eyebrows too. Suspicion swirled around anyone who seemed a little too enthusiastic about scrubbing. So where's the fringe detail? Well, in one town, Shekespeare to be precise, a chronicler mentions a bathing bell, rung every Saturday evening to remind citizens to get clean for Sunday Mass. People could be fined not just for skipping, but for bathing at improper hours, namely during sermons, feasts, or the Lord's afternoon nap. And of course, someone always tried to game the system. One clever merchant claimed that since he owned 3 bathtubs, he could be logged as having bathed thrice in one sitting. The clerk was not amused. You finish your soak and step outside into the cool dusk. Your skin glows pink. Your hair smells of rosemary. The clerk, ever diligent, appears again. "Next bath? 2 Thursdays from now," you say with a nod. He writes it down, satisfied. As you walk back to your lodgings, the evening air seems less harsh against your skin. The laws might be odd, yes, but there's something oddly comforting about a society that believes so deeply in the power of warm water and a fresh start. In a world full of mud and mayhem, maybe a good bath is the closest thing to a reset button. You're strolling through a bustling medieval city, maybe London, maybe Krakow, maybe somewhere in the Low Countries where fashion always seems to go just a little too far. Merchants shout their wares, cartwheels creak over cobblestones, and chickens, inevitably, scatter underfoot. Then you see them. Shoes. Glorious, ridiculous shoes. Curved to the sky like a goat's horn, some nearly as long as a forearm. Bright red leather, gilded tips. A trio of noblemen strut by, each more hobbled than the last. One even has a tiny chain attaching his shoe tip to his knee to keep from tripping. You've officially entered the world of the poulain and the bizarre medieval laws that tried to stop them. Poulains, also called Krakows, after the city of Krakow, were a style of pointed-toe shoe that swept through Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. What started as a sleek silhouette quickly became absurd. Shoes extended 6, 12, even 24 inches past the toe, curving up and out like a fancy ski. It was fashion gone feral. Naturally, the powers that be were not amused. Sumptuary laws across Europe attempted to ban or restrict the length of shoe points, especially for anyone not of noble birth. In 1463, the English Parliament went so far as to limit toe extensions to 2 inches for commoners. Anyone caught exceeding the limit could be fined, or even jailed. Fashion jail, that is. Worse, some towns required cobblers to measure shoe tips with a wooden ruler known as the pointing stick, just to make sure no one got cheeky. Historians still argue whether these laws were driven more by moral panic or just good old-fashioned jealousy. The church claimed poulains were a sign of vanity and sin, their phallic symbolism too obvious to ignore. Secular leaders, meanwhile, worried that impractical shoes would hinder soldiers or craftsmen. Some sources even suggest poulains caused serious foot injuries, like curled toes and tripping-related sprains. But the people? They loved them. You pass a tailor's stall where a man is trying on a new pair. Bright blue velvet poulains with tiny bells on the tips. A crowd gathers. He takes 3 delicate steps before tipping forward like a toppled candlestick. Everyone applauds politely. The fashion war escalated. Some cities taxed poulains, while others banned the sale of shoe points over a certain length. A German town required anyone wearing them to carry a walking stick of safety, essentially a pole to stabilize yourself against the sheer ridiculousness of your footwear. Fringe detail time. In one French city, grooms were forbidden from wearing poulains to their own weddings. Why? Because priests feared the shoes would trip them on the altar steps and disrupt the holy sacrament. One priest is even quoted as saying, "The devil enters through the toe." And yet, not everyone followed the rules. The wealthy, as always, found loopholes. Some had removable tips they could unscrew before passing guards. Others paid bribes. A duke famously had his poulains made of silver and wore them only indoors, claiming they were decorative furniture rather than shoes. You duck into a cobbler's shop, where a craftsman shapes soft leather over a wooden last. The longer the toe, he says, the shorter the conversation. He grins. They're all just trying to out-peacock each other. Outside, you spot a notice nailed to a post. All footwear to be no longer than 2 inches beyond the toe. Those in violation shall forfeit said shoes to the public pile. Yes, there was a public pile. A heap of confiscated poulains, reportedly burned every fortnight in some places. It smelled, predictably, like roasted hubris. As you walk back to your lodging, your sensible boots feel suddenly uninspired. You imagine gliding down the street in a pair of silk poulains, the tips swinging like pendulums. You'd probably fall. But oh, what a fall it would be. It's well past sunset now, and the stars have taken their places like obedient little soldiers. The village glows faintly with lantern light and candle flickers through open windows. Somewhere, a lute strums lazily, and someone is humming a tune that seems to drift on the breeze itself. You hear footsteps, then laughter, then rhythmic stomping. You turn a corner into the village square and find yourself face to face with a half circle of dancers. They're swaying, clapping, spinning in gentle spirals, their shadows leaping against stone walls. Young and old alike whirl and smile under the moonlight. It's sweet, joyful, innocent. It is also, technically, illegal. Welcome to late medieval Germany, where in many towns, dancing after dark was banned, especially on certain holy days, market evenings, or when too much merriment was suspected. That's right. In cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and parts of rural Bavaria, night dancing was deemed not only immoral, but downright dangerous to the soul. And depending on the year and the mood of the magistrates, the punishment ranged from fines to shaming rituals, and in one particularly grim town, a forced public reading of psalms in monotone before the entire parish. Because nothing says, "I've learned my lesson," like chanting Psalm 119 in front of your neighbors with the enthusiasm of a sleepy squirrel. Historians still argue whether the bans were about genuine piety or just a sneaky way to keep the streets quiet. After all, nighttime dancing was often associated with drinking, flirtation, and sometimes clandestine courtship. A few too many ale-fueled giggles and suddenly there's a scandal. The town council, fearing both the devil and the birth rate, stepped in with their pen and ink. But as with most things banned in the Middle Ages, dancing didn't stop. It just got sneakier. One popular workaround? Silent dances, where the musicians stayed home and participants clapped out rhythms softly with their hands or feet. It looked like group prayer, until someone twirled. In Strasbourg, one mayor complained that townsfolk were hosting what he called kitchen feasts, private gatherings in back rooms with soft shoes, low candles, and very quiet lute plucking. He sent constables to sniff them out, but was thwarted repeatedly by soup pots placed strategically as cover. Fringe tidbit? There were actual dancing police. In some towns, night watchmen were given whistles specifically for breaking up illegal dance circles, much like a referee calling offside at a soccer match. One chronicler jokes about 3 blasts for the waltz, 2 for the jig, and a sharp yell for anything French. Even the church weighed in. Bishops issued edicts forbidding unmarried persons of opposite sex to make rhythmic contact after sundown. The wording alone could kill the vibe. You pass a tavern now, its shutters cracked just enough to hear a slow, deliberate beat. Inside, a few brave souls sway gently. Not quite dancing, but not dancing either. You take a seat on a low stone bench, and an old man nearby leans over. "Used to dance every Thursday," he whispers, "right on this square. Then the preacher caught us and made me read Ecclesiastes while standing in a washtub." He smiles. You both chuckle. Then he adds, "Totally worth it." Even in this world of rules, people find ways to carve out joy. And sometimes joy looks like a woman in linen skirts, stepping carefully to a beat no one can quite hear. Eyes closed, arms wide. You get up and try it too. Just a few steps, just a little rhythm. The stones beneath your feet don't complain. The moon, at least, is still a fan of dancing. The morning arrives with a soft drizzle, dampening the dirt roads and lending the village a hush, broken only by the low murmur of animals and the squeaky complaint of wooden cartwheels. You're following your nose toward the market square, where the smell of bread mingles with that of livestock and the sharp tang of geese. Lots of geese. They waddle between stalls, honk indignantly, nip at unattended hems, and over near a tethered post, a constable stands watching a boy with a goose under his arm. The goose honks loudly, flapping. The boy freezes, because here in 14th century Poland, stealing a goose isn't just a minor offense. It's a serious crime. In some jurisdictions, goose theft could carry the death penalty. Absurd? Maybe. But very real. In certain Polish towns, particularly in rural districts where livestock formed the backbone of household wealth, geese weren't just poultry. They were currency, livelihood, and in some cases, dowry items. A good goose could lay 50 eggs a season, could guard a garden better than a dog, could be herded in flocks to market like squawking bags of silver. So when one went missing, it wasn't just theft, it was economic sabotage. Historians still argue whether the harsh penalties were often enforced or mostly symbolic, a kind of scare tactic to keep petty thieves in check. But at least two surviving legal codes, one from Sandomierz and another from a Pomeranian village, list goose theft among capital crimes, especially if it involved breaking into a co-op or stealing from a noble estate. Now, there were loopholes. For example, if the goose honked loud enough to wake witnesses, the thief could sometimes be spared, on the grounds that they were too clumsy to be truly malicious. A honking goose, in this logic, proved the thief was unskilled and thus redeemable. Of course, proving the honk wasn't always easy. One infamous case tells of a man who brought 3 witnesses to court, all swearing they'd heard the stolen goose honk at the moment of theft. The judge, famously skeptical, insisted on a demonstration. The goose in question refused to perform and sat down, completely silent. The man was fined, but spared execution. The goose, one assumes, received no commendation for civic silence. You stroll now between coops and cages. A woman sells goslings in straw-lined baskets. She tells you how, when she was a girl, her brother was nearly whipped for swapping a neighbor's goose with one of theirs, just to win a wager on egg-laying records. He got caught, of course. The neighbor recognized the goose by a tiny black spot on its beak. He wept. The goose honked. There's a strange logic to the whole thing. In an era where the line between survival and starvation was feather-thin, even the loss of one bird could tip the scales. Laws that seem laughable today were deadly serious then. A goose wasn't just food. It was fertilizer, feathers for bedding, and, occasionally, a burglar alarm. Fringe fact: in some villages, people painted their initials on goose eggs with crushed berry juice to mark ownership. And a particularly paranoid landlord in Lesser Poland reportedly hired a goose boy whose only job was to sleep in the barn with the birds. You stop at a shrine by the roadside, where someone has left a small wooden carving, a goose with a halo. It's a local legend, apparently, a tale of a holy goose that warned a village of raiders with one mighty honk, saving dozens. Since then, no one's dared eat goose on holy days. As you sit by a quiet pond, watching a gaggle drift by like tiny feathered boats, you marvel at it all. The drama, the danger, the dignity, of geese. Who knew these fluffy, squawking chaos machines could inspire such fear and reverence? And as one honks loudly at you for daring to sit too close, well, now you understand. That's not a bird. That's an economic asset. The scent of flour and smoke leads you now down a side alley, past a rattling handcart and a yawning dog, until you find yourself in the warm heart of the medieval English market. Bakers are setting up their stalls, spreading linen cloths, arranging loaves in neat pyramids. There's something comforting about it all. The soft clatter of wooden trays, the scent of yeast, the gentle clamor of people beginning their day. And then you hear it, the clanging of a bell, sharp and deliberate. Heads turn. A man with a scroll strides into the square and calls out, "Let all ye hear, the bread assize is to be enforced today." And just like that, a ripple of tension passes through the bakers. Because in medieval England, the weight and price of bread were not left to chance or market whim. They were regulated by law, under a system called the Assize of Bread and Ale. First enacted in the 13th century, it laid out in remarkable detail how much a loaf of bread must weigh in proportion to the current cost of grain. It was the kingdom's attempt at fairness in an era where famine always hovered near the edges. Bread was the staple food. If you cheated the loaf, you cheated the people. And so, the bread inspector became a feared and often ridiculed figure, a sort of medieval food cop, with scales, standards, and a sharp eye for crusty deception. You watch now as one such inspector sets up at a public table, placing lead weights and brass scales with a kind of ceremony. One by one, bakers are called up. Their loaves are weighed. Each passes or fails under the gaze of the town magistrate. And if a loaf is light, well, that's where things get interesting. Punishment ranged from fines to public shaming. In one particularly delightful tradition, offending bakers were sometimes forced to wear their underweight loaves around their necks, strung like stale necklaces, while parading through the village square. Children would giggle, grandmothers would tisk, and local poets, yes, really, might compose satirical verses to mock the offender. A fringe tale tells of a baker in York who shorted his customers by exactly the weight of one mouse's tail, claiming it was negligible. The inspector, unimpressed, had him paraded while a jester followed behind, holding a giant wooden mouse and shouting, "Justice for crumbs." Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistent or more theatrical than punitive. But there's no denying the seriousness behind the law. Grain prices could swing wildly depending on weather, war, or harvest. To keep bread affordable, towns pegged the loaf's weight to the cost of wheat, sometimes updating the values weekly. Complex tables were created, with parchment columns detailing what weight per farthing a loaf must meet. And so, bakers had to constantly recalculate recipes, adjusting their dough like accountants needing spreadsheets. Woe betide the baker who forgot to check that week's wheat rate. You pass a stall now where a baker offers you a thick, round loaf, still warm, speckled with caraway seeds. He smiles. "Full weight. Even a little over," he says proudly. "I'd rather feed a neighbor than feed the pillory." Indeed, some towns rewarded bakers who consistently exceeded the weight, with minor tax breaks or civic praise. Others simply remembered their names at Mass. But don't get the idea that every baker was out to swindle. Many were poor themselves, caught between rising grain costs and strict price controls. Some even offered a baker's dozen, 13 loaves for the price of 12, to avoid accidentally shorting their buyers. It was an insurance policy of sorts, and a practice that stuck around long after the assize faded. Later that evening, you sit beneath an eave, nibbling a heel of sourdough. The crumb is soft, the crust pleasantly toothy. You think of the bakers, half artisan, half mathematician, trying to balance justice and sustenance, all while dodging public rhyming ridicule. And suddenly, that crust tastes even better. The candlelight flickers low tonight, shadows dancing on the plastered walls of a snug little tavern nestled somewhere between the Alps and the Rhine. Patrons sip wine from earthenware mugs, the air warm with wood smoke, clove, and laughter. From the corner comes a faint clatter, The click of dice rolling across a board, followed by groans, cheers, and the unmistakable sound of someone losing a week's wages in a single roll. But then, abrupt silence. The tavern keeper holds up a hand. "It's the feast of St. Ulrich," he says softly. The dice vanish. Because in medieval Europe, especially throughout Germany, France, and the Low Countries, gambling, particularly with dice, was strictly banned on holy days, and sometimes altogether. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. Dice games like hazard and raffle were considered dangerous temptations, signs of idleness, and gateways to greater sin. And so, laws sprang up with a righteous flourish to stop them. You slide onto a bench and watch as the tavern patrons now pretend they were merely rearranging mugs. One man makes an elaborate show of explaining a riddle. Another kicks the dice under the table with his boot. The city statutes are clear. No games of chance on Sundays, feast days, or during religious observances. Enforcement varied, but the penalties could include confiscation of goods, fines, or in certain puritanical pockets, public penance, sometimes involving prayer recitation or temporary tavern bans, which, let's be honest, was the true tragedy. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about piety or simply efforts to regulate vice and limit tavern chaos. After all, dice weren't just fun, they were volatile. Wagers often turned violent. Clergy warned that dice opened the door to the devil. In fact, one 13th century sermon claimed that Satan himself invented dice to distract the masses from contemplation of their sin. And yet, people loved them, which meant secret gambling dens flourished. Behind butchers' stalls, in monastery cellars, in bathhouses after curfew, dice found a way. In some cities, entire underground networks emerged where monks and merchants alike could sneak in a quick game between vespers and dinner. One cheeky tale from Bruges tells of a nun who ran a side hustle as a wager keeper, managing bets and doling out winnings under the guise of distributing alms. She was eventually caught when someone reported she had too many candles lit for a Tuesday. You're handed a cup of warm spiced ale by a man with a mischievous grin. He leans over and whispers, "Want to see something?" He lifts the tablecloth and reveals dice carved from bone, with tiny engravings shaped like saints' heads. "For holiness," he chuckles, "in case we get caught." There were even forgiveness dice, carried by gamblers hoping to repent swiftly should they be discovered. One side read mercy, another alms, another confession, and so on. Roll the right combination, and perhaps the priest would go easy on you. You step outside for air and find a town crier pasting a notice to a post. "Let it be known, dice and cards shall not be played upon feast days, nor within the sight of sacred buildings, nor within 20 paces of any waterfowl. Offenders shall be corrected." Wait, waterfowl? Well, yes. Some towns had ultra-specific additions to their gaming bans, citing disruptions to geese, agitation of swans, or frightening of ducks. Historians are still scratching their heads on that one. As you walk along the quiet lane, the moon hanging low like a milky eye, you hear the faint click of bone dice once more. Behind a boarded window, behind the walls, always just out of sight. The game continues. Quiet, cautious, unstoppable. And somehow, in a world of plagues and wars and bread weighing, that soft clatter in the dark feels oddly hopeful. A little roll of rebellion. A prayer cast in chance. The morning sun slants low across a narrow Italian street, gilding tiled roofs and casting long shadows between rows of hanging cloth. Scarlet, indigo, saffron, bolts of fabric flutter like banners in the breeze. A weaver hauls a basket of yarn up a ladder. A child ducks beneath stretched linen. And from a tiny stone workshop wafts the unmistakable scent of vinegar? You've arrived in the 14th century Florence, or maybe Bologna or Lucca, anywhere that cloth ruled the economy, and you're about to meet one of the strictest guild laws in medieval Europe. It was illegal to dye cloth without a license. Yes, truly. Not just discouraged, prohibited by civic law, with stiff penalties for those who dare dabble in color without official approval from the local dyers' guild. Because in this era, Fabric wasn't just fashion. It was commerce, identity, and politics. And dye? Dye was power. The dyers' guilds were among the most influential in Italian city-states, and for good reason. Dyes were expensive, fickle, and labor-intensive. Extracting red from madder root, blue from woad, and gold from saffron threads required years of training, guarded recipes, and the patience of a saint. So towns legislated fiercely to protect the trade. Unauthorized dyeing was labeled a civic offense, akin to counterfeiting. Offenders could face fines, have their cloth seized, or, in one famously colorful case from Siena, be locked in a vat of ochre dye for educational purposes. You chuckle at the image, a very yellow apprentice bobbing gently, swearing to never touch a vat again. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily about quality control or guild monopolies. Likely both. Guilds guaranteed standards, but also squeezed out competition, especially from poor women dyeing homespun cloth in backyards. And while the guilds were often open to skilled artisans, entrance fees could be brutal. If you couldn't pay, no license, no dye, you wander past an inspector's stall now, where bolts of freshly dyed cloth are being poked and sniffed. The official wears gloves and a suspicious expression. "Too much alum," he mutters, rejecting a batch of what looks like violet wool. The dyer groans. It's lavender, not violet. A fine is issued. In Florence, it was illegal to dye certain high-status colors, like imperial purple or deep vermilion, without not just a license, but also guild rank. Some colors were reserved for clergy, nobility, or civic pageants. A mere merchant trying to sneak some crimson into a tunic might find himself in trouble. Fringe tale. In Venice, a dyer once tried to pass off onion skin yellow as royal gold. He was caught when it rained and the color ran. He was paraded through town holding a soggy tunic and a sign that read, "May my cloth fade like my honor." You stop at a dye house and peek inside. The air is rich with steam and spice. Women stir vats with long poles. Hanks of yarn hang dripping from rafters, a rainbow overhead. One older woman beckons you closer, pointing to a jar. "Secret," she whispers, showing you a paste made of boiled walnut husks and wine lees. Makes the brown deeper. But don't tell the guild. You wouldn't dream of it. Because in these alleys and workshops, color is survival. To dye is to claim a stake in the economy, in artistry, in daily bread. And the law, as always, hovers close by, ready to fine, punish, or silence those who step outside the sanctioned palette. As you walk away, a scrap of scarlet cloth flutters by your foot. You pick it up, turn it in the light. Illegal or not, it's beautiful. And it reminds you, even in a world ruled by laws, color always finds a way to bloom. The sun is lower now, casting long amber streaks across a Swiss mountain village nestled like a secret between pines and glacial stone. Bells toll in the distance, soft and sorrowful. A funeral procession winds its way up the hill, slow and solemn. Black veils, white flowers, a single lute playing a tune that sounds like the end of summer. You step aside to let them pass, feeling the hush of grief settle over the cobblestones. A woman in a dark wool dress walks behind the pallbearers, her eyes dry, her back straight. But don't let that composure fool you. She'll be watched very closely for the next 6 months. Because in this particular Swiss canton, widows were not only expected to grieve, they were legally required to do so. That's right. In some parts of 15th century Switzerland, particularly in small rural parishes, widows could be fined for excessive merriment during their mourning period. If a woman laughed too freely, danced at a village feast, or was seen smiling too often at market, she risked being reported. And the consequences ranged from public scolding by the parish priest to actual monetary penalties, payable in silver coins, or in one bizarre case, geese. You find a bench near the churchyard and listen to a trio of old men gossiping softly over mugs of thin beer. "She chuckled at the fair," one says. "Only 4 weeks in," another replies. "She claimed it was a sneeze," says the third, "but it sounded cheerful." Historians still argue whether these widow codes were about public morality or control over inheritance and behavior. Likely, it was a mix. A woman's grief was expected to match her late husband's social standing. If she laughed too soon, it was interpreted as disrespect, or worse, suspicion. Was she happy he was gone? Did she help him on his way? Of course, not all regions enforced this bizarre decorum. But in certain conservative enclaves, a widow's emotions were quite literally policed. Parish records include notes like, "Widow Anna did not wear black to Pentecost," or "Margaretha seen in tavern, smiling." And what constituted excessive merriment? That part was always vague. One fringe tale from a village near Lausanne tells of a widow fined a small sack of flour for singing while she baked. She claimed she was humming hymns. The magistrate claimed he heard a tavern tune. The truth? No one knows. But the flour was collected. You walk now through the cemetery. The gravestones lean and lichen-covered. A small wooden sign catches your eye. Widow's rest bench, quiet reflection encouraged. Please refrain from jesting. There's no one there, just an abandoned kerchief and a single plum. Maybe left as a tribute. Maybe smuggled out from a feast, eaten in secret behind the chapel, where no one would see the smile that followed. Of course, people found workarounds. Widows would laugh indoors, behind closed shutters, share private jokes with sisters. Some even kept grief journals, writing out funny memories they couldn't share aloud for months. One woman wrote an entire collection of animal fables just to keep herself sane, and pretended they were for children. But sometimes, the law struck hard. One unfortunate soul, a widow named Lisbeth, was spotted playing skittles at a village fair just 9 weeks after her husband's passing. A neighbor reported her. She was summoned and sentenced to recite the 10 Commandments aloud while walking backward through the main square. The baker claimed she got to "Thou shalt not covet" before bumping into a mule cart. Still, despite it all, women endured, and occasionally they rebelled. In one documented case, a group of widows in Basel formed a mourners' guild, where they agreed to cry at each other's funerals, and then hold private wine evenings to decompress from all the performative sadness. These events, recorded only in marginalia, were known as the Sigh Suppers. As the bells toll again and the procession vanishes over the hill, you sit in the quiet, reflecting on how strange it is that joy, pure, spontaneous, human joy, could be illegal. And yet, in a world so shaped by sorrow and survival, maybe laughter was just too powerful to be left unchecked. The wind is sharp today, whistling low across the flat Dutch landscape, rattling shutters and tugging at cloaks like a mischievous ghost. You stand on a raised path, overlooking wide green fields cut into squares by glittering canals. In the distance, wooden blades slice the air, windmills, tall and proud, turning slowly against a sky full of motion. They look peaceful, almost meditative. But here in 16th century Holland, where every breath of wind is currency and every field a battleground between land and sea, the placement of those windmills isn't left to chance, or even common sense. It's governed by law. A very, very particular law. Because believe it or not, in parts of the Netherlands, it was illegal to build or place a windmill without precise municipal approval. And that approval depended on everything from wind direction to water rights to, not joking here, neighborly wind-sharing ethics. You follow a narrow bridge across a canal and into a hamlet where 3 windmills loom like sentinels. A man in a blue cap is angrily pointing at a 4th, much smaller windmill perched at the edge of a farm. "It steals wind," he shouts. "The angle is wrong. It's selfish." You soon discover that this is not an exaggeration. In towns like Delft and Leiden, wind rights were a very serious matter. Windmills were vital not just for grinding grain, but for draining marshy land and powering water wheels that kept entire towns above sea level. A poorly placed windmill could disrupt airflow, reduce a neighbor's output, and cause flooding or famine. And so came the laws. Town councils created elaborate zoning rules for windmills, specifying height, rotation angle, proximity to roads, and even paint color in some cases. Offenders could face steep fines or be ordered to dismantle their structures, sometimes with dramatic flair. One fringe case from 1547 tells of a miller who built his mill 4 paces too close to a canal path, violating Leiden's wind ordinance. He claimed ignorance. The council responded by staging a wind walk, where officials held feathers in the air to demonstrate disrupted breezes. The mill was torn down. Historians still argue whether these rules were fair protections or just fuel for neighborly disputes. Likely, both. Some records show families feuding for generations over a single mill shadow. Others reveal clever negotiations. One man allowed a neighbor to build closer than usual, but only if he shared half his flour. And yes, wind sharing was a real concept. Some communities issued wind licenses, granting temporary or seasonal access to breezes in exchange for civic favors or grain donations. In especially dry years, these became prized commodities, traded like spices or gold. You walk now past a guild house where a carved plaque reads, "He who blocks the wind blocks his brother's bread." Beneath it, a rusting weather vane spins lazily. In smaller towns, disputes were settled by wind juries, groups of appointed elders who would stand outside with damp fingers in the air and declare judgment based on the sacred science of draft and direction. One scribe notes a particularly windy trial where all 5 jurors had to hold onto their hats while delivering a verdict. And don't think urbanites were immune. In Amsterdam, windmill permits were auctioned annually, with bidding wars between merchants whose shipping docks needed steady millwork for sailmaking. A bribe of butter once tipped the scales in favor of a cheesemonger. You duck into a windmill now, marveling at its inner workings. Wooden gears creak like old bones. Flour dust hangs in the air. The miller offers you a smile, then whispers, "Built this one by the book. Wouldn't want to curse the whole village." Outside, the wind shifts slightly. A mill down the lane stops turning. You realize, in this carefully balanced world, the wind isn't just weather, it's a delicate contract. A resource managed not by whim, but by law and neighborly obligation. You breathe in the crisp air, tinged with salt and bread. And as the windmills resume their slow, solemn turning, you understand. This is harmony, written in breeze and timber, guarded by parchment and pride. Twilight has fallen gently across the French countryside, that lovely in-between hour where everything softens, colors, voices, even the clinking of mugs in the local tavern. You make your way up a cobbled path toward one such establishment, L'Étoile Paisible, the peaceful star. Golden light spills from the windows, laughter hums like a lullaby, and the smell of rosemary and cider floats on the air. You step inside to a warm welcome. A dog snoozes by the hearth. The innkeeper nods and pours you something mulled. All is cozy, familiar, safe, until someone says in a low voice, "Just make sure no one lets an owl in." You blink, "Pardon?" The innkeeper nods gravely. "The village law is clear. No owls in taverns. Not since the incident." That's right. Tonight you've landed in one of the stranger corners of 15th century rural France, where in at least a few parishes and hamlets, according to local bylaws, ecclesiastical records, and more than one highly specific woodcut, owls were officially banned from taverns. Historians still argue whether this rule stemmed from legitimate superstition, awkward symbolism, or just one too many feathery bar fights. But the law was real and peculiar. To the medieval imagination, owls carried complicated associations. On one hand, they symbolized wisdom, companions of scholars and sacred to the Virgin Mary in some iconography. On the other, they were linked to death, misfortune, and the demonic, thanks to their eerie cries and nocturnal habits. Their sudden appearance in human spaces, especially where ale flowed freely, was seen as an omen and not a good one. In some villages, owl sightings near a tavern preceded deaths, illnesses, or drunken brawls. One surviving document from 1473 accuses a certain Henri the Younger of harboring a bird of ill counsel, after several regulars at his inn came down with food poisoning. The owl in question had roosted in the rafters for days. It was captured and, allegedly, exiled to the forest under bell, book, and candle. Fringe detail? There was actually a recorded case of a man being fined for bringing a tame owl into a tavern to impress a woman. She swooned, possibly from the wine, but later claimed the bird had cursed her into a season of melancholy. The man had to apologize publicly and donate a cask of mead to the parish. You sip your drink as a group of old-timers recount a tale about the great owl night, when a snowy owl burst through a tavern chimney during a wedding feast. It landed on the cake, flapped madly through the rafters, and caused half the guests to flee into the snow in their undergarments. The priest ruled it divine punishment for dancing on a Wednesday. From then on, a law was posted. No owls to be kept, admitted, or invited into public houses, on penalty of exorcism or ale suspension. That last one was the real motivator. Some landlords even took to hanging painted signs of barred owls crossed out with red slashes. Others stuffed lavender into rafters to discourage roosting. And one tavern allegedly hired a boy to whistle every few minutes near the chimney, just in case. But of course, not all saw owls as bad luck. A few rebellious towns celebrated them, keeping carved owls over their doors as symbols of watchfulness and wisdom. In one protest, a group of students in Angers staged a mock trial where the owl was declared friend of the philosophers. The bird, played by a puppet on a stick, was acquitted. Ale was had. The tavern was fined. You lean back now, fire crackling beside you, the room full of sleepy conversation and mellow warmth. No owls appear, not tonight. But you sense their presence just outside, perched in the trees, watching with quiet disapproval. They were banished, yes, but perhaps they never really left. Because in every superstition, every strange law, there lingers a tiny, persistent question. What if, just once, the owl was right? The sky is ink black now, stars pricked out like embroidered glass above a quiet English hamlet. The fires are low, shutters drawn, and the only sound is the gentle snorting of pigs in their pens. Yes, pigs, your final legal oddity tonight. Because in medieval England, tucked within the winding scrolls of royal statutes and town charters, there existed a peculiar little law with unusually high stakes. It was considered treason to name your pig after a member of the royal family. You read that correctly. No calling your pig Prince Henry, Lady Elizabeth, or heaven forbid, King Richard. Doing so could be seen not as a joke, not as a rural quirk, but as a criminal offense against the dignity of the crown. You blink in disbelief as an elderly farmer tells you the story of Tom the pig, a now legendary swine from Sussex, who was casually nicknamed Edward after the local reeve, unaware that the reigning monarch shared the name. Word spread. Someone tattled. The farmer, baffled and boot-covered, was dragged to court. Historians still argue whether these charges were consistently upheld, or if they were mostly symbolic threats, reserved for enemies of the state or particularly unlucky peasants. Either way, the Treason Act of 1351 made it very clear. Insulting or mocking the king's authority, even through livestock, was a dangerous game. The rationale? Royals were seen as divinely appointed, their names sacred symbols of order and law. To assign such a name to a snorting, mud-covered creature was to invite disorder, disrespect, and in the worst interpretations, outright rebellion. Because if a pig could be Queen Margaret, well, what next? A goat in the Parliament? There's a fringe tale from Norfolk of a family who raised a pig named George with no ill intent, only to face interrogation after a neighbor claimed the pig had grunted treasonously. The accusation didn't stick, but the pig was renamed Piggy. Safer that way. You stroll past a sty now, where a round, pink creature snoozes peacefully under straw. A small wooden sign hangs on the pen. No royals here, just pork. It's funny, yes, but beneath the chuckle lies a deeper truth. Names carried power. Uttering a royal name with the wrong tone, or on the wrong tongue, could suggest sedition. And pigs, with their stink and silliness, made the perfect canvas for satire, which is exactly what the crown feared. One ballad from the time pokes fun at a pig named Harry, who refused to obey commands. It was popular in taverns, then suddenly vanished from songbooks. Coincidence? Even monks weren't safe. A cloister in Kent was reprimanded after a pig named Arthur wandered into the nave during Mass. The bishop declared it blasphemous and issued an edict. All animals must bear neutral and fitting names. Thus, the era of pigs named Buttercup, Chestnut, and Scruff began. You sit now on a low wall, listening to the quiet grunts from nearby stables. It's absurd, you think. But then again, so many laws are. They're not just rules. They're reflections of what a society fears, what it reveres, and what it refuses to laugh at. And this law, it whispered, mock not the throne, even with hooves. The stars above wheel on. Somewhere, a pig dreams of apples and mud and, perhaps, wearing a crown. But not tonight. Not here. Tonight, the pen stays peaceful. Now, as the last flickers of torchlight fade and the wind hushes through the trees, we drift quietly away from the crowded markets, the noisy milliards, and the echoing halls of law. The village is still now. You walk slowly past shuttered homes, where candles gutter low in their holders. A dog yawns in its sleep. A chimney exhales one last puff of fragrant smoke. The tavern is dark. No owls tonight. Just the hush of a resting world. You feel the earth under your feet. Cool stone, damp moss, a softness to everything, like the night has taken a deep breath and settled. Those strange laws, the forbidden shoes, the scolded laughter, the outlawed chess and garlic, feel far away now. Echoes from a world both familiar and foreign. A world where people were still trying to understand how to live together, how to behave, how to name their pigs without starting a war. You pause by a quiet stream. It murmurs its way through the reeds, endlessly patient. And above, the stars wheel on, soft and slow. Let the images fade now. Let the sound of distant bells become nothing more than a rhythm in your breath. The oddness, the humor, the long-forgotten rules, they can rest for now. Tonight, you're just a traveler in time, your feet warm, your eyelids heavy, and wherever your dreams take you next, just promise not to name any royal pigs. Good night.